There is a regal air to Dan Really Likes Wine this week because finally, he's a difficult man to track down. We have got the probably the high priest of South African wine with us on the show this week, who also happens to be a great friend and gives me the greatest challenge ever because we've got 806 hours of conversation to get into one single episode. I suspect if we can manage it, you'll see him back very soon indeed. Michael Fridjhon, welcome.
Very nice to be here, and I really like your new studio. This is fun and a fun place to be. Thank you.
We built the entire place just for your arrival.
I'm expecting that, and that's how it works. Yeah, exactly.
I was reminded the other day, the familiarity breeds contempt. It's certainly not contempt, but I do sometimes need to be reminded just what an influential figure Michael Fridjhon is in this industry of ours, not just in South Africa, when a restaurant which normally takes months to get into and charges skyrocketing fees. I made one phone call after you had made an introduction and they basically gave me the date I wanted, the table I wanted. We can't possibly charge you anything. You are a friend of Michael Fridjhon. Which for me summed up many things. One is it's very good to be able to know you and drop your name happily, which I do regularly. But also, and I wonder how often you do this or take the time to do this, is just stop for a moment and reflect back on just what an extraordinary career in wine you have had.
I have, people say I've been fortunate and it looks like false modesty, but timing was everything. I came into the wine industry when there was very little basic expertise, so my upward mobility was disproportionate to my skills at the time. I learned a lot on the job, I continued to learn, and I have grown with the wine industry. That's the really interesting part, that if you go back 40 or 50 years and look at the volume sold, the amount of what was produced that landed up in brandy rather than in wine, the interest in wine and the excitement around wine, I really have been at the right time in the right place, and it's been a wonderful ride.
I don't discount that, but the huge part of that is the other side of the equation. The industry has grown, but you've been a big part in driving that, and that's happened all the way through this remarkable career of yours. And to be able to do it, other than the ability to write well and be effortlessly charming and always look like you've walked out of a Barber catalogue, you have an incredible understanding of wine. And that without that, you wouldn't be able to do what you do. When did you discover that this was your superpower?
That's a good question. I came into wine because of a misspent youth. So this goes back a lot further than would have been legal. I was fortunate because my parents' friends loved wine, and that was unusual at that time in Johannesburg. And they had very broad tastes in wine, and good wines and good international wines were unbelievably inexpensive, both because that's how wine was in those days, and also because the rand was very strong. So I was exposed to lots of good wine, and I had a lot of fun. When I went to university, I kept thinking one day I'm going to grow up and get a real job. And
that might still happen. I'm not discounting that.
I'm not giving up on the idea. But in the meantime, I was too distracted by wine to make any serious career decisions. So I carried on studying, I got degrees, I became involved in things like wine education. But all along, all I did was cobble a living doing what I really wanted to do, and it's been a fabulous ride.
You also have this remarkable ability with wine. I remember not that long ago, you'd picked up a wine that we were tasting, and just casually, as though it's something anybody would say anytime, very similar to a Montrachet I had in '76 with Princess Grace Kelly at a bar in Monaco, and it's just this extraordinary compartmentalization of, I remember this, it ticks a box, I know what this is. And that for me is completely supernatural.
I think that, and I know there are people who are really talented blind tasters in the sense that once they've tasted something, they put it into them. It's like a face. They know that face, they put a name to it, and they're away. I'm bad with names and faces, but what I am good at, I think, is the analytics. So when I taste a wine, I unpack its component parts, and those usually help me to say what it is and where it might have come from. At the same time, there are those moments of pure recognition, that it kind of gets you between the eyes and you know what you've tasted. And the other thing, of course, is that if you've been drinking wine for as long as I have, that memory bank of flavors, of experiences, of wines and how they evolve, that knowledge that something which tasted like lemon juice with a spot of alcohol 40 years ago has now turned out to be a splendid bottle of very mineral Chardonnay, is just something that you need to have traversed all those years tracking the bottle in order to get there.
There are a lot of bottles in that memory bank because still every week you're tasting hundreds of wines as you work your way through. I've seen the trucks backed up outside your reciprocal headquarters with deliveries from hopeful winemakers that they might get an audience with the great Michael Fridjhon. In the very beginning of that wine memory bank, is there a wine that almost kicked it all off, a wine that the angels started playing their harps and suddenly you realised what wine meant to you?
Yeah, there was. There were probably two, and they were Burgundies, and so they were Pinot Noirs. And they were Pinot Noirs made in an era in which, as the Irish said, you had to buy a case to find a bottle. It was a time when great Burgundy was splendid, but a lot of Burgundy was very ordinary. And one was a Clos de l'Ombre, which in those days cost in Johannesburg 4 or 5 rand a bottle. And my parents were friendly with the importer, and so were several of their friends. So people would arrive at lunch or supper with 25 or 30-year-old magnums of Clos de l'Ombre as the gift you bring when you arrive for dinner. And I found that wine hauntingly beautiful. The second was a Richebourg, and it was the last bottle that my father had bought at a time when he thought he had money. And he, by then, knew he didn't, and so we thought we would drink it to celebrate his important birthday. I think it was his 60th. And I'd read about it. I'd never had a Richebourg. It was a Romney Conti Richebourg. And Hugh Johnson said it will be redolent of oriental spice, you know, the kind of tasting notes that you roll your eyes at and say, it cannot be so. And I pulled the cork out of the bottle, and it was exactly that. It was the first time when I didn't need to drink the wine to enjoy it. I could simply sit there and sniff it, which I did most of the evening, and then the rest of the evening I spent sniffing the empty bottle. So it did look a bit weird. But the idea that something as elementary and elemental as a grape could turn into such a multi-dimensional experience, that's the part when I kind of knew that I needed to know more, understand more, and to pursue it.
The chain reaction of you falling in love with wine is that you've made so many others fall in love with wine over the years, through your writing, through presentations, through the events you have, through giving wine to people. Is that the source of greatest joy in the Michael Fridjhon wine career?
Probably. I think that the pleasure of engaging with people, finding the common ground that wine does deliver, and then watching them light up with the discovery, with the enjoyment, with the fact that it's added a dimension to their lives. You know, it's very easy to say that when you've got money, you can buy whatever you like. But the point is, A, you don't always need to have a lot of money to enjoy wine. And secondly, unless you get the full pleasure, there's almost no point. It's either, you know, an accompaniment to a meal and it means nothing, or it's something that resonates. And when you get to the point where you tap the little button and you watch that resonating begin and continue, it's very gratifying.
Often when I have winemakers round for dinner, aside from the fact that there's the looming fear that I'll never get rid of them, their first request before a glass of wine is a beer. And I often see winemakers at the end of the day, they just feel like a cold beer. They've been working with wine all day. Are there days when you just think, God, I cannot actually face a glass of wine. I just love an ice cold beer. I pour myself a whiskey. I need a bit of a break from wine.
You know, it is true. And I noticed that the first time I was judging in Australia in an era when it was considered normal to judge between 200 and 250 wines a day, usually 1 or 2 year old Shirazes straight out of the oak. I mean, it was just it was a shocking experience. And at the end of those days, and 3 or 4 days of a capital show, they're long days. All the winemakers, all the judges arrive with their special bottles and go off to dinner. And they sit down and they play guessing games with 64 Petrus and whatever. And I remember going to the first of those dinners thinking, actually, I would much rather just have room service and skip all of the formalities around this. So the answer is yes, a long day tasting. You don't really want to drink more of what you might have been tasting. But there are days when I've been very busy, tasted a lot of it is young wine. And the way to kind of recalibrate is just to go and find something that's much older. It's gone from that primary, fruity, plenty of tannin stage to much silkier, much more perfumed, more secondary. It's more evolved and it's more complex. And there is a difference, I think. And maybe the other way of looking at it, I've only thought of this now, is that if you are a nursery school teacher and you really love your work, it doesn't mean you don't want to come home and have adult company.
That's a very, very good way of putting it. It stems from your experience as a judge, and you've been doing so much judging. One of the great modern lines from pop culture is the Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. Michael Fridjhon, with a single line, can make or break just about any wine estate in the country. And I say that slightly flippantly, but you do have an enormous amount of influence. How conscious of that are you when you think, you know, this wine, if I give it 98 points, they're sold out and the owner's retired in the med for the rest of her or his life. I give it 70 points and they'll never work in the industry again. Does that ever come into your thought process?
Only in the sense that you are conscious of the responsibility. But firstly, almost all that judging is done blind. So you don't know, in a sense, whose fate is so-called in your hands. The second point is, though flattering it may be to think you have that power, the reality is that I think a really rave review can help. I think if you're not enthusiastic, if you even rubbish a wine, you're not going to put people out of business. I had this discussion with the late Peter Devereaux, who was the founder of things like the Diners Club Winemaker of the Year Award. And Peter had a view that if you don't have something positive to say, don't say it at all. I've always thought that that's wrong. I argued with him at the time. I said, we also have a responsibility to consumers, that this is not about puffing only the good. It's about saying what's wrong with the bad in a way that isn't destructive or isn't intended to destroy, but is really about a suggestion, hard as it might be, that there are other ways of doing this that might be more successful.
The coverage that you give to wine is extensive, and because you're covering so many wines, and we have a couple to look at in a second, when you describe them, you do so beautifully and you bring wines to life. You talked a little earlier of some of the language that can be a little over the top, and a wine has got a whiff of a late autumn afternoon in Helsinki on the back end of a football match. People throw all sorts of stuff in, but the flip side to that is when you are writing about your 3 millionth bottle of Sauvignon Blanc, even for the great Michael Fridjhon, the vocabulary does have its limits on how you can describe a glass of wine.
I think words around wine are absolutely finite, and I think there's value in that discipline. So if you look at the tasting notes on wine, was that they are short and crisp, because I think that there are clues in every one of the standard descriptors that you could apply to a wine. So if you have a Chardonnay, it's got flavors on the sort of citrus spectrum. They will do. Are they lemony, limey, grapefruity, tangerine? And all of those tell you something about the ripeness level. So an underripe or very so-called mineral Chardonnay is going to be lime and lemon. A more tropical style will be a richer, riper style. So by choosing those words carefully, you're saying to the astute reader, this is a wine in this style, and you can choose, therefore, do you want it lean or do you want it generous? And so using words that are fairly constant, I'm not often looking for new words, because what I'm trying to do is to keep it tight and useful for the consumer, and useful for me when I go back to my note to say, It is that style of wine. I was in Europe about 2 weeks ago, traveling with a colleague and doing lots and lots of winery visits, and obviously taking plenty of notes. And he had lost his notes about one of the wineries, and he needed to make some purchase decisions. And I could literally flick through the notes, and even my Sanskrit-like handwriting, I was able to tell him pretty much everything he needed to know about the wine that he'd lost the notes for. And so that, I think, is where notes are useful. You've seen at the Wine Judging Academy that the point of the note is to think about what you're tasting and then narrow it down to exactly what it is that that wine is telling you. That said, I sometimes love those Helsinki notes. Tamlin Curran, who writes for Jancis Robinson, writes the most evocative and the most poetic notes. She talks about wine that tastes like water if you've been drinking it out of a rusty farm tap. And that was a city on the hill descriptor for, I think, Catinta Barocca. And actually, it's a very good descriptor if you've ever done that. But that's not useful for many people unless you've just spent your lifetime drinking water out of rusty taps. But sometimes it's the evocation that is what induces that excitement in the wine. I think it was Eliot who wrote about the objective correlative, that the point about the image or the metaphor, or in the end the poem itself, is to create a meaning that is beyond the meaning of the poem, and that it correlates to something else. Those notes work as long as the concepts that are used aren't alien to the reader.
I remember Vickers Human, one of our great young sommeliers, pouring a glass of wine at an event and giving it a quick go once over, looking at me saying, "That's a freshly opened can of tennis balls." And I thought he was being a completely pretentious knob. Took the glass of wine and went, "Yep, that's exactly what I get as well." So there is, I suppose, a balance to be had. And it's also an opportune time, before we jump into the wine, to say a quick thank you for that Wine Judging Academy experience. You terrified the lot of us. You worked us to the bone. You are a slave driver and unrelenting. And I think on day one at 8:30 in the morning, we tasted our first wine, and at 8:44 that night, our 97th wine with palates that were wet cardboard. But it is probably the most rewarding wine knowledge experience I've ever had, because you gave a set of guidelines and parameters that now when I'm picking up a glass of wine, I just approach with so much more intent in terms of wanting to know more about it, being able to place it, get an understanding of it. And that was the real reward for an amazing 3 days. So thank you.
It was a great pleasure. I'm glad you got so much out of it. You were, as you now know, the star student, so well done.
This speaks very poorly of the rest of the class, but thank you nonetheless. We have some wine. Now, you can be a deeply, deeply horrible man, and you were at first, because with a smile I should have interpreted, you pulled out an empty bottle. The last person to do that was the great Khalilo, who pulled out 2 empty bottles because he told me he wanted to talk about them, but he liked them so much he'd finished them the night before. You then, of course, pulled out a second bottle, which we're going to drink in a moment. But the first one is somebody who's a good friend to both of us. He's a South African icon, and that would be Mr. Eben Sadi.
Absolutely, and it's his new wine, his new release. And the reason I thought it was really important is what drives that particular planting, that particular project. And as Eben says, in a way, it's the culmination of everything he's been doing since he started off. So he says 21 years of experience in that bottle. And it's new plantings, whereas we normally associate Eben with, discovered old vineyards and what to do with them. But this is Eben planning for the future, not just for his children's future, but perhaps even for the future of wine industries beyond our own borders. He's looking at varieties that cope with heat and water stress. And he's looking to see whether we will have, as the 21st century advances, wines that are better suited to the environment that we are inevitably moving into. I think that it's possible within a few degrees of temperature change that many of the famous varieties that are or have been at home for 200, 400, 1,000 years in a particular place will partly adjust to climate. So it's not as if You'll never again be able to drink Pinot Noir from Burgundy just because the temperatures have gone up. But it also doesn't mean that we have to slavishly follow the varieties that time, experience, or just arbitrary good luck put in various places. So this is a very carefully thought out project. It's a field blend in that the vineyard is planted, I think, to 12 varieties. It's been planted in such a way that they know where the beginning and the end of each of those varieties is. So in that sense, it's not a completely interplanted vineyard, but it means that they're able to track the evolution of those grapes. They in fact harvest them in 2 separate batches as opposed to a single. You pass through the vineyard and that's the whole job done. But the intention is, by pruning adjustments and as the vines grow into each other's rhythm, that they really will be able to harvest the entire block in one hit and produce one wine. And I thought that was delicious. So Eben was around yesterday. We tasted that wine. I then took it to a lunch where there were lots of great vinous curiosities, and as you can see, it didn't survive the lunch. But the really interesting thing is that it was quite unlike any other wine I'd ever tasted. It was very forward. It had lovely fruit. I think you can at this stage taste that the vineyards need more age to give more texture and complexity to the palate, but it's still a fabulous bottle of wine. And that, in a way, it's shining a light on a path we may well have to traverse. We may, as an industry, as all industries, have to look to a different future around wine. And for people like Eben to take he didn't need to do that. You know, he could carry on doing what he's doing for the rest of his life and, you know, take the money and run. But he thinks in a multi-generational way. And I think this may be the beacon that the Cape needs, certainly that the Swartland needs, because it is arid and it is hot and it produces some of our most exciting wines. And all of those old vineyards are not with us forever. So a new future has to be found.
It's part of that balancing act with wine where we invest so much faith and belief and love in the history and the heritage, while at the same time wine by its nature is a creature of evolution. And just as the bottles change over the years, so the industry must as well. And it always has, but Eben perhaps showing us just how much more needs to be done and maybe giving us a wake-up call. I want to ask about that in a moment, but there is another bottle of wine before we do that. This one, thankfully, has got some wine in it, so you are forgiven for bringing an empty bottle along with it. And this one's really cool because it's an unusual space. It's a grape that not that long ago was very much a brandy production workhorse, and quite a cool character is making it as well.
Yeah, I mean, it has everything. You said bring a bottle of wine that's full of interest. So in my very early days in the industry, when I had the job of bulk blending wine for retailer-owned brands, I would wander off to the Royberg Co-op and take tanks and tanks and tanks of wine and add a bit of this and a squidge of that, etc., etc. And the building blocks for what was the style of the day, there was a wine made by Bellingham called Bellingham Premier Grand Cru. It was a dry white wine. It was the biggest selling premium dry white wine in South Africa. And if you wanted a kind of buyer's own brand that could match it, what you needed was bone dry, fragrance, a certain amount of freshness, but not a searing acidity. And the building blocks for my, house brand for Benny Goldberg's was Colombar from around Royberg, some Chenin Blanc, a little bit of Claret Blanche, all the stuff that actually would have gone into the cheapest of dry whites or been distilled for brandy, because that's what those vineyards were planted for. And most of those vineyards, of course, have gone because with the evolution of the industry, with the end of isolation, people looked at those varieties and said there's absolutely no point. We now know that Claret Blanche, to go to another of those varieties, produces great freshness at low alcohol. It's become hugely important in Chateauneuf du Pape, where the alcohols have risen in one lifetime from 13 to 16% on reds and probably very close to the same on whites. So finding varieties that ripen at low alcohol is a way forward. Colombard does much of the same thing. This wine, as you know, comes from Bertie Coetzee at Loeferland. He's got this huge agricultural enterprise in Prisco, of which I think there are 9 or 10 hectares of grapes planted because he likes the idea of having vineyards, and it's not a crucial part of his agribusiness. And he's persuaded 2 or 3 winemakers to vinify the fruit. So this fruit goes from Prisco to cellars in the Western Cape and gets turned into, in this case, a delicious wine.
Well, cheers. Thank you for bringing it along. And once it's tasted, your 2 brief challenges, the traditional Michael Fridjhon tasting note, and then should we call it the Greg Sherwood tasting note, and the more colourful interpretation.
That's quite a double challenge. So what I like about the wine is, firstly, while it's youthful, it has colour, and that colour has got that lovely green edge, which for me, you just know that there's acidity to carry the fruit. Secondly, and that's one of the interesting things about Colombard, it's not like Chenin, where you know you're going to get a compote of apricots, or Chardonnay, where you're going to be on a spectrum of citrus. Here, the notes are much more melony. So it's a bit like Cantaloupe, Spansbeck. It's got a little bit of that citrus, but it's not citrus like lemon or lime. It's much more like a kind of dried naartjie note, and that gives it that mid-palate feel. Its acidity is very present, but not in a way that is aggressive. It refreshes the palate. Imagine you have a plate of prawns with a lemon butter sauce, and that's quite an oily, kind of a greasy. You'd turn to a wine like this and it would kind of complement and cleanse your palate, because the acidity is working hard without being invasive. What you call the Greg Sherwood note, and we have had our run-ins over that, is we know we can't taste more than 3 or 4 different flavors in one batch. You can come back to it, the glass may evolve, you might find 1 or 2 more. But the Greg Sherwood, which is the original kind of Robert Parker note of dollops of red fruit, brambles, plum, whiffs of mulberry, some blueberry and blackberry in the background, and just a smidgen of youngberry as you move on to the palate. It's too much. You can't possibly have picked that all up. And my experience talking to people who come to wine, or have come to wine quite recently, is that they feel intimidated by the fact that they can't taste those things. They think that they are taste blind, and that other people just have this God-given gift to taste 6 or 8 different fruits in one glass of wine. I don't think that that's helpful or useful. And if you know, and I'm confident that there's melony notes there. I could have supplemented by saying hint of kiwi fruit, but come on, sit down. How often do you get anything out of kiwi fruit except that vague whiff of greenness, which is there, but it doesn't enhance your tasting experience. There is a very little bit of that kind of stone fruity note, but it's much greener than stone fruit. It's not nectarine, it's not peach, it's not apricot. Using those words to fill out the sentence isn't helpful, and actually the wine has to speak for itself.
I am getting the melony notes, more though Juliet notes is an air hostess, a nightclub and a dance floor in the small hours in the morning in New York. But I'm also getting 27 other notes, which I now can, having done the Michael Fridjhon Judging Academy, so that is all your fault for getting so much out of it. The real purpose of this little exercise is not to break down this particular wine, but just to give an idea of the adventure that you can have in a glass, and when you're under the guidance of an expert, it allows for an enormous amount of fun. Your expertise around wine extends to plenty of writing on the subject, and it's not always happy reading. One can never criticise Michael Fridjhon for shying away from difficult topics and honest opinion. And in closing, because you've got the first of 17 tastings to get to for the rest of today, you recently wrote a piece which it had some fairly harsh truths about where the industry is and the challenges that the industry faces, and we certainly don't shy away from them. I think you made some sad but very pertinent points. But I will ask you, as a parting note, to set aside the cloud that hangs over wine and to find some sunshine for me, and to give me the reason that gives Michael Fridjhon the most belief in our South African wine industry going forward.
Well, that's actually easy. Despite the difficulties, what is good about wine and wine in South Africa? We have an inordinately vibrant, enthusiastic, and adventurous industry, and that's a function of where we are in our own history. It's a function of the fact that for very long the industry was constrained by legislative restraints. It was also an industry in which people kind of walked well-trodden paths. Instead, we now have the second generation, really, of truly adventurous winemakers who are both looking for the most exciting sites because they can't afford to own them, but can contract to get the grapes. So that's a very important part of what has made the new South African wine industry so successful. And as those younger winemakers, the Urban Sadis, the Chris Alharts, the Molyneux, what has made them what they are now doing in new plantings, in future thinking. So that's the one part. We are dynamic in a way that the industries of the world that are facing the shrinking consumer base, they haven't had to pivot as often as our winemakers have had to. The second thing is because of our country. So our country is evolving and is evolving middle class. And we're doing it, I think, too slowly. We're doing it in the wrong way. We can talk long and hard about what is wrong here, but that new class is emerging. And you only have to have been at WineX for the last year or two to have seen, and it comes with the change of headline sponsor. Standard Bank has brought a crowd that is very clearly part of the new South Africa and is enthused by wine. So elsewhere in the world, wine industries are talking about losing consumers. We are gaining them all the time. That is really exciting. It means that as a winemaker, if you're prepared to go out and engage and meet with consumers and share the joy of wine with people who are predisposed to learning about it, you've got your job, in a sense, laid out for you. The third part is attached to that. We're on the continent of Africa, and exactly the same thing that is happening here is happening in many places on the continent, and it's on our doorstep. So too bad if we're not going to be able to sell our wine to the United States. We can turn, pivot, plan, action. We have to be adventurous, we have to be innovative, and we have to be ready to engage. We have all of those talents, so I truly believe that this isn't just a glimmer of light, it's a great big searchlight illuminating the path.
It is a welcomely upbeat note on which to finish. I know that you are still playing around in the wine industry until you get that proper job, but I hope the proper job holds off just a little longer, because as national treasures go, I think you're pretty much top of the list in the South African wine industry. So thank you, not just for a delightful session on the show, but for all of the great times and many great bottles we've had together, and for everything you do for the South African wine industry, because we are a far richer place for everything you have contributed, Mr. Fridjhon.
And that's very kind of you. Thank you. Thank you for having me on the show. And I wish it big audiences, lots of success, and for your upcoming holiday, a great break.
Much appreciated. We're going to have him back on the show just as soon as we can afford his obscene appearance fees in the next little while. One of the greats of South African wine on so many levels, but also just a seriously cool person to hang out with over a glass of wine, the ageless, timeless, and quite wonderful Michael Fridjhon.